Listen to the Gospel according to Mark, his accounting of the resurrection. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They'd been saying to one another, "Well, who'll roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be afraid. Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid. For those of us who are here today, Easter is rather like a mystery story where you've already skipped to the end of the book to see how it turns out. The surprise is gone. The shock doesn't touch us. And because we know what these women find when they get to the tomb, we forget what they expected to find. And what they expected was one very dead body. There were no undertakers, and like so many women through the centuries, they were going to take care of the body of a friend, to wash him and lay him away with loving hands. They would perform one final service for Jesus. The women went to the tomb to deal with death. And all that week they'd been willing to deal with it. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they were there when it happened. So many of the others were afraid and ran away, but they had stayed. And it was not a pleasant thing to see. Death never is. But this was one of the bad ones. Crucifixion was a long, slow agony. And sometimes it went on for several days. The women were lucky they only had to watch it for one day. And there was nothing they could do. They couldn't stop it. They couldn't make it easier. The only thing they could do was stand and watch. And later, when it was over, they watched Joseph of Arimathea bury the corpse. It was a hasty burial because night was falling, and with it the Sabbath, when all the work must stop. So bury the body quickly, do the essential, spend 2 days and a night, 2 nights and a day, knowing that the task wasn't finished, that there was still more to do. Then go back, bright and early that next morning, go back to do the final honors to a body dead 2 days in a hot climate. They were that willing to deal with the reality of death. They were that willing to see it for what it was. They went to the tomb and entered. No hanging back, no evading reality. They entered the tomb. They walked into the place of death itself. And there was the angel of resurrection. Willing to look at death, they found new life. And there's a sense in which that's true for you and me. In order to find new life, we first have to experience some kind of death. We have to be willing to enter the various tombs of our lives and recognize death for what it is. How do we know what it looks like? Will we know it when we see it? How does it feel? Well, the most obvious thing about tombs is that we use them to hide away the things we really don't want to look at. For very good reason. We don't want to know what's going on in there. Seal the tomb, and we don't have to deal with what's inside. And you know, each one of us has that kind of place in our own lives. There are things we just don't want to deal with. They disturb our peace. They make us know things about ourselves that are discomforting. Perhaps it's the way we've wronged someone else, some hurt that we've caused, a way in which we have failed others or failed ourselves. Every one of us has that kind of place in our lives. There are things that we hide away. And sometimes we hide away from situations in the world that we just don't want to confront. If you're like me, you're overwhelmed by the reality of what's happening in the Middle East, and frankly, the blight that's too much of Wilmington. We don't know what to do, so we just hide it away. Seal the tomb. Hide away the unpleasant, the decaying, the dying. You know, tombs are small and narrow. They're places of confinement, not release. So whatever hems us in, whatever restricts our spirits, that is a kind of tomb. And we keep our ideas small and manageable. We get trapped into old patterns of thought, of action that kind of narrow our world and hem us in. We see the restrictions, not the possibilities. Tombs are places where we hide things away. They are small and narrow, but above all, they are places of decay and death. And isn't that what sin is all about? Sin leads to death. We try to pin it down to rules or categories. Do this, don't do that. Stay away from X, Y, Z. A is more serious than B. The real test is, does it lead to life and growth, or does it lead to decay and death? Does it hurt innocent people? And if it does, then it's causing decay and death in them. And if it leads to death and decay, then it is part of the tomb. It's one of the dead places that we have to confront. And entering those kinds of tombs takes courage, just as it took courage for those 3 women to enter the tomb that first day of the week. It takes courage to look at the things that we would rather hide away. It takes courage to acknowledge the old patterns that confine us and hold us in. It takes courage to face the places where we've hurt other people. It takes courage to face the reality of sin in our lives. What helps us do that? Why did those women enter the tomb? Because that's where Jesus was. Jesus was willing to enter the tomb, willing to face death, spiritual and physical, and it's only because he was willing to go all the way through death into the reality of the tomb, suddenly new life broke forth. He could have avoided it. All he needed to do was stay out of Jerusalem that Palm Sunday. He could have gone back to Galilee and kept his mouth shut. He could have avoided death. But without the crucifixion, there is no resurrection. What is it the angel said? You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He is risen. And in the place of decay, there's growth. In the place of confinement, there's release. In the place of hiddenness, light shines. Look at the death in your own life. Enter the forbidding tomb, and there you will find the promise of resurrection to new life, both here and in the world to come. Amen.
Something I used to find very annoying as a 15-year-old that I appreciate now is riding in the car with my mom. In California, if you're driving in the left lane, you're committed to going at least 85 miles an hour. And my mother is definitely not committed to the 85. She's a solid 55, 60 mile an hour driver. So she's off in the right lane, and I hated it as a teenager, but now I appreciate it. But one of my favorite things in the car with my mother, if we're having a conversation, she'll be talking to me, and then she'll say, and then we need to make sure that, and she'll just do that. She'll drift off. And it's a fun game to play with my siblings about how long is she going to bring it until she brings it back to realize that she's in the middle of a conversation with us instead of leaving us in the middle of this sentence. The leading us in the middle of the sentence is what happens at the end of Mark. Now, I'm sure all of you are very well versed in how the ending of Mark happens, right? Of course, yes. So the ending of Mark, I'm going to read for you verse 8. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now, if you open your Bible in the pew, if you go home, there's going to be more that you see in Mark. But all biblical scholars agree that what I just read was the actual very early manuscripts. It ended with that. But see, our English translation actually cleans that up a little bit for us, because in the Greek, it actually ends in mid-sentence, like my mother. The Greek translation would read, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid for. And it trails off. That's it. You don't get any citing of Jesus. You don't get any resolution to the story. You don't have Jesus coming back and saying, "No, I'm still here. Look at my hands. Look at my side." You don't get that in this early manuscript of Mark. Now there's a movie that came out about 15 years ago, and I'm going to spoil the ending of the movie for you. Now it's been out 15 years. If you haven't seen it, I'm sorry. The movie is called The Sixth Sense. In The Sixth Sense, Bruce Willis plays a character named Malcolm, and Malcolm is a child therapist, psychologist, and he has a client named Cole. And Cole is a young boy, and Cole's he's kind of off, he's kind of reserved. You'd call him a weird kid. And Cole says to Malcolm, the therapist, that he sees dead people. But these dead people, they don't know that they're dead. They're kind of walking around the world, walking around the earth, as if they're still alive. They think their family is still there, and they're in the house with the families. So you see Malcolm work with Cole to unpack this thing that's happening in his head. And at the very end of the movie, you find out that Malcolm is also a dead person. So when you see the end of the movie, your mind starts to go back to the beginning. Did I see any signs? Right? Do I remember signs that would give it away that Malcolm was one of these dead people? And if you watch the movie again, yes, you see these signs throughout the whole movie. But the first time through, you aren't sure. You don't really know if he's one of the dead people or not. Now the same is true for this story of Mark. And in The Sixth Sense, we almost need the ending to understand the beginning. At the end of Mark, all you see is this angel in the tomb, and he says to the woman there, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. Now the book of Mark is filled with something that we call the Messianic secret. The Messianic secret is Jesus talking to his disciples, talking to the Pharisees, and he's confusing a lot of people. He's giving these parables that don't really make sense. They leave, they're kind of unsure. Jesus even tells them you're not supposed to get them right away. But there's an even deeper level to this Messianic secret. Every time Jesus tells the disciples that he's the Son of God, or that he is going to be risen from the dead, or that he can perform miracles, he then tells them, but don't tell anybody. Don't go out and tell us anybody. So it's this idea of I'm the Son of God, but I don't want anybody to know just yet. So these disciples, these women at the tomb, they've had this story of being confused. So of course they're confused when they come to this tomb. Are we going to see this dead body? Are we going to see some miraculous miracle? Well, what is it that we're going to see? They come there confused about where Jesus might be. But the angel gives them a hint. The angel simply says, Jesus is back in Galilee. There you will see him. So if we take Mark, the very ending ends mid-sentence. Let's go back to the beginning. The first introduction of Jesus we see in the Gospel of Mark is not a birth story, but it's him thrown out into the wilderness. And the very first movement that Jesus has out of the wilderness is coming to Galilee. The first mention of Jesus says Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. So we come to the end of Mark. We're left on this cliff about what is happening. What do we do? Well, we go back to the beginning. This is where he is. He's in Galilee. He is in the work of curing the sick. He is in giving sight to the blind. He is in the feeding of the hungry. He's in the freeing of the oppressed. All these things that he did in Galilee. It's almost as if these disciples who were no-shows at the tomb, but these women, they forgot the story. They forgot everything that they saw and that they witnessed. When I first moved to Wilmington, I took a job over at St. Mark's to help coach the girls' track team. And the head coach, we became friends, and I did his wedding a couple of months ago. And whenever I do a wedding or a funeral and I give some analogy during the sermon, I usually get somebody who hasn't been to church so well and come and say, that was a really cool, interesting story that you told. So I do this running analogy during the wedding, because him and his wife are both runners. And it comes time for dinner, I'm sitting at the table, and there's a man that I've met a couple times at different track meets. His name's Kevin. And Kevin was really intrigued by the story that I told during the ceremony. So he's sharing with me the story about his mother. And Kevin's mother was from North Jersey. And in high school and in her early teens, she was this amazing track athlete. She won state championships in the 100 and the 200 at the very early stages when they were letting girls participate in sports. And she was on these junior national teams. And she was going to be this great, amazing track athlete. But she decided to forego that and to get married and to have kids. And when she had Kevin was the runner of the family. So Kevin and her bonded early on about what it's like to run. They shared this experience, this desire to run with each other. So Kevin's in his late 60s now. So fast forward a couple of years, and Kevin's mother is having a serious case of Alzheimer's. And it's obvious that she's on her last leg. She hasn't even called him Kevin in 2 years at this point. And they're sitting in her living room, and she's on her recliner, not focused, just kind of out there. And all of a sudden she perks up, and she looks over at Kevin, and she picks her hand up, and she slams her hand down on his thigh, and she says, Kevin, are you still running? And Kevin says, yeah, Mom. And she says, good. And that was it. And the next day, Kevin gets on, puts his running shoes that whole week, blisters on his feet, legs super sore, because he forgot the story. He forgot what it was that he shared with his mother, and that was running. See, we too forget the story of the resurrection. We too forget the story that the resurrection happened. We forget that we can find Jesus in the work of being his disciples. We forget that in our times of sickness, in our times of doubt, in our times of uncertainty and sadness and loneliness and worry and depression, we can find the risen Lord. So if you go and look for him in the tomb, you won't find him. But if you go to where there are hungry people, if you go to where there are thirsty people, if you go to where people are being oppressed, if you go to places of injustice, there you will find the risen Lord, just like he told you. So don't forget this story. Go back to the beginning. Our God has already conquered death and now lives among us.